in the Middle Ages, men were born into this language of faith. And while they may have sinned, they recognized that they were sinners and they got themselves to the confessional. And to the extent that there was order in Christendom during the Middle Ages, it was because men tried to be holy. And to the extent that there wasn't, it was because they were sinners. And God would send chastisements, wars and plagues, chastisement, natural disasters, to call their minds once again to the things of heaven, to live according to first and last things. And as it grew organically, as a result of the great monastic work of St. Benedict in the West, St. Benedict of Nursia in the West, with his great monastery at Monte Cassino, which was bombed by the so-called Allied forces. The great, and St. Benedict was not a friend of ecumenism. In his book, I think it's called God in the World, Joseph Ratzinger, then so-called Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger wrote, was it 1999 or 2000? He wrote, and most of these things are lectures that he gave that were later transcribed. There were certain Christian hotheads who destroyed the symbols of false religions and temples of false religions. Well, among those hotheads, Benedict, was Saint Benedict, who destroyed the temple of Apollo atop Monte Cassino. What do you think about that one, huh? It's incredible. It's incredible, the blindness, trying to project back onto our saints the mind of modern man, of modernism. It's incredible apostasy. Monastic work. Towns grew up around the monasteries. People prayed the office, the divine liturgy. They assisted the monks. Some lived on the monastery lands and for a nominal rent, sometimes a tithe of whatever they produced. And they did that in perpetuity. It was a system of justice. And this learning was kept alive in the Middle Ages, in the monasteries. And eventually what grew up, eventually organically, was what we called the social reign of Christ the King. It had to be written down. It didn't have to be an encyclical letter. We have what is called the Sensus Catholicus as a result of our baptism. A sense of what is Catholic. That is why after what happened with the so-called Second Vatican Council, many Catholics, seeing things far more clearly than I did, because I was in my late teens. By the time the Novus Ordo came in I was 18 by the time the Novus Ordo came in 1969. And I was preserved from the Vatican Council, because I went to religious ed in St. Dominic's when I was at Oyster Bay High School. I went on release time from Oyster Bay High School. We had moved from Great Neck to Oyster Bay, and I wanted to go to St. Dominic's, which was the local high school there, but it was too late to apply. So I went to St. Dominic's. I went on release time on, I think it was Wednesday afternoons, marched up Anster Street to St. Dominic's. After a few of those classes, it wasn't what I had learned in St. Aloysius from kindergarten through 6th grade, so I told my parents, I don't want this. This is just not Catholic. There's something wrong with this. It's just not right. So I didn't really like the Novus Ordo all that much. I went back and stayed away for a while. Went back in '74 when I was getting my doctorate at the State University of Newark and Albany at a church in Troy, New York, and a very fine man, Father Mitchell Nejame, convinced me to come back. And so I had stayed away because I had this sense it was wrong. But many people just didn't permit themselves to be drawn in. I permitted myself to be drawn in, shame on me, but I had a lot to learn. And I experienced a whole lot, and so saw a whole lot, which is why I could write my book on the Novus Ordo during warfare. I saw a whole lot. I thought I was suffering with my Lord, but my Lord wasn't there with me at that time. But many people left because they had the Sensus Catholicus. They said, this is not Catholic. We don't need everything written down as a Catholic. There's not only sacred tradition, there's also small t tradition. And we know what's Catholic and what's not. It's not invalid. But we have a sense of what's Catholic and what's not. And over the course of time, organically, without it ever being written down, Pope Gelasius did a pretty good job of writing it down about the two swords by which we are governed. And but over the course of the first century, the first millennium rather, even though many rulers didn't like the fact, generally there grew up what was called the social reign of Christ the King, that those who ruled understood that they had to rule according to the mind of the divine Redeemer, and that if they did anything that was contrary to the good of souls, Holy Mother Church, after discharging her indirect power of preaching, of teaching, of exhortation, of remonstrating with the leaders to change their ways, she could take punitive action either before something contrary to the good of souls was instituted or after it had been done. An interdict on the reception of the sacraments, which has occurred on some occasions, some public reproof of a civil leader, of a king or a duke or an emperor. And there were some great exemplars of the social reign of Christ the King during that 1,000-year period, among them Edward the Confessor in England, St. Wenceslas in Bohemia, who personally, with his own kingly hands, made the Eucharistic bread. St. Louis IX, King of France, he who was probably the greatest exemplar of the social reign of Christ the King, who wrote a letter to his son Philip, telling his son Philip in the 13th century that work to remove all sin from your land, particularly blasphemy and heresy. Work to remove all sin in the land, particularly blasphemy and heresy. That is, sin there will always be, but a civil ruler has the obligation to foster those conditions wherein Catholics may be better able to sanctify and save their souls. Because the more that Catholics are able to sanctify and save their souls, the better able they will be to be instruments of order in society. As even Plato noted in the 5th book of the Republic, as go order in the soul, so goes order in society. And he knew that from reason alone, unaided by the light of divine revelation. None of our so-called rulers understand that today, do they, ladies and gentlemen? Not one understands this in the slightest. Not one. Blasphemy and heresy are more serious crimes than anything else. Not to minimize crimes against property and persons. Those are serious. And evidently there's a great deal of looting taking place on the East Coast. That's not being reported, surprise, surprise, by the press to protect the reigning Caesar. And I guess they're going to say the looters are entitled. Once it comes out, the looters are entitled to it because, after all, they needed to have their justice and redistribution. And they will never be prosecuted. They will never. How many people have been prosecuted for the murders that took place after the acquittal of Rodney King in the Simi Valley trial, or the acquittal of the police officers in the Rodney King case in the Simi Valley, in the trial that took place in Simi Valley, California in 1992? There were 62 people killed. How many people were prosecuted for that? 0. Even the people who were caught beating truck driver Reginald Denny in South Central Los Angeles were acquitted. What a system. Anyhow, we're not minimizing crimes against property or persons. But crimes against God are greater in the hierarchy of evils. Blasphemy is a grave offense. Now, St. Louis IX went to extremes, and the Pope, exercising the social reign of Christ the King, the Pope remonstrated with St. Louis IX in the 13th century to say, no, you're being too harsh. And St. Louis IX corrected his ways. He was still concerned about blasphemy, but he had gone too far to punish it civilly. There are other ways to deal with it. But heresy has no right to be propagated publicly. As St. Augustine noted, the death of the soul is worse than the freedom of error. Heresy leads to the death of the soul. We live in a country where error is propagated under the so-called aegis of freedom of speech, freedom of press, and freedom of religion. We have temples of error, big Protestant temples of error. They get their millions of dollars. This one place we saw in Sugar Land, Texas, was it? Sugar Land, Texas, one huge place, I think it was, or Stafford, somewhere around there. On our way to St. Jude's Shrine, we would see all the time, on the corner of US 59 and US 90 Alternative, I think, and a huge place right next to a Chevrolet dealership. And I mean, they would bus people in from all over. They had shuttle buses from various universities. There's no money in the truth here, folks. Lots of money in error because people want to have, as St. Paul noted to St. Timothy, they want to have their ears tickled by false doctrine, whether in Protestant churches or in the conciliar churches. They could be assured everyone goes to heaven. Everyone's fine, just be yourself. Loving God will never send anybody to hell. No, loving God won't. Basically, we send ourselves to hell. We make the choice here. We die in a state of final impenitence. We go to hell. It's really that simple. We don't say, at least minimally, my Jesus mercy, which might be good enough to get us heaven if we're members of the Catholic Church. Maybe. But we shouldn't take that chance. And heresy, though, which is propagated under cover of law in this country, wantonly, freely, is an offense to God, because God came in the flesh so that we would have access to the truth. It is difficult to know, difficult enough to do what is true, even when we know what is true, even when we know there's certain sins and faults we must quit, faults we must correct, even though we know our faults. It's difficult enough to do what we know is right. God doesn't want us being confused about what is right. That's why He's given us a Catholic Church. She who can never be stained by any semblance of doubt, error, confusion, or ambiguity. No less, of course, of sacrilege in her liturgy, profanation in her liturgy, of abuse in her liturgy. She is spotless. She is the spotless virginal Lamb of our Lord, who teaches infallibly, the infallible guide to our salvation, the means of our salvation, giving us the supernatural helps to get home to heaven. St. Louis IX warned his son, therefore, to be on guard against both blasphemy and heresy, to be submissive to his father on earth, the Pope. And the true Pope, true legitimate successor of St. Peter, cannot give you error of any kind. Cannot put in doubt purgatory. Cannot say that, well, limbo is, according to a theological commission, that's not binding, you understand. Limbo, maybe a poem may or may not be so. We don't really know. Pope St. Pius X said, well, you know, yes, as a matter of fact, yes, there's limbo. Again, not dogmatically defined, but it's a theological certainty there's limbo. It's not limbo. The souls of the unbaptized babies go to hell because you've got to be baptized to go to heaven. Unbaptized babies can't have the baptism of desire. They can't have the baptism of blood. Because unlike the holy innocents, the preborn today are not dying for Christ, in the place of Christ. They're not being killed in the place of our Lord. They're being attacked. Limbo is a sign of God's mercy. But since the Orthodox don't believe in limbo, and since they have fuzzy concepts about purgatory, everything's in fuzziness for the Ratzinger, Benedict, adopts the Orthodox view on many things, meaning the Eastern Orthodox view on many things. And that's why I have an article, I think in 2011, called From Sharp Focus to Fuzziness. Purgatory is dogmatically defined. It's a stay, it's an actual place. St. Louis IX was mourning his son. Heresy matters. Blasphemy matters. We must reject both. A civil state cannot know order as long as men, if blasphemy is widespread and heresy widespread, no less amongst what people think is the Catholic Church, but it's not. There can never be order in a society. It leads to all their sins. Sins against God lead to sins against man. We can sin against God, we can attack our fellow man. St. Canute of Denmark, another exemplar of the social reign of Christ the King. St. Elizabeth of Hungary, though she was a queen, to her very beloved Louis of Thuringia, she served the poor, and she suffered after her husband died. She was thrown out of her castle, and the very poor, to whom she was kind, rejected her. What a great example she is to us of love, of service to the poor, and so many countless others. St. Stephen of Hungary, whose own family was converted because of his own ancestors were converted because of the then ongoing missionary efforts of Central Europe that were supported by the king, first of all, the king of Germany, the king of Bavaria, later the Holy Roman Emperor, St. Henry the Emperor, my own confirmation patron saint, Thomas Albert Henry Drolewski, St. Henry. And these great exemplars of the social reign of Christ the King, doing all to build up their kingdom for the honor and glory of God, to exhort their subjects to personal piety over the course of time. St. Louis IX hearing sometimes 3 masses a day, usually 2, sometimes 3 masses a day. Third Order Franciscan, reading the breviary. The epoch, the era, the high point, the zenith of this epoch of history, the Middle Ages, was the 13th century. It was the time that Father Denis Fahey says the divine plan, although not without imperfection because of fallen human nature, realized the greatest perfection we have ever known it to be. And so the divine plan of our Lord was met perfectly by as perfectly as possible during that 13th century. The 12th century before had been a time of some moral dissolution. There was the rebirth, though, and the great spread of devotion to Our Lady cause was spread by the great monk, the tremendous Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who, along with his Holy Family, all of the blessed members of his family, so devoted, Blessed Humbeline, his sister, his mother Alice, his father, all of the family that overtook Christ, as the book was written about the family of Saint Benedict, of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, fighting heresy in his own day, fighting moral dissolution in his own day, and all of the great example of the saints that led up to the 13th century. But in the 13th century, God raised up 2 men who made possible the flowering of Christendom in that 13th century. One was born in 1184, and his name, of course, was St. Francis of Assisi, who in his 42 years of life, of austere penance, what became austere penance, teaches us yet to this day to accept all for love of God and to be profoundly in love with our Lord in his true presence, and to embrace Lady Poverty and to embrace the humiliations of the world. He was rejected by his own father for a long time, cast out of his house, made a prisoner in his house. He who was cavalier in his youth, wasted his time, went off to battle, didn't go too far, and then was caught in one of the city-state wars, in the Perusian War, and was a prisoner and brought joy to his fellow prisoners. But through his penance, through his embrace of Lady Poverty, through his Eucharistic piety, and his deep, deep and profound devotion to the Mother of God, St. Francis was able to rebuild the church. As the Pope saw him coming, had a dream of a little man in brown who was going to rebuild the church, and St. Francis had a great deal of difficulty getting in to see the Pope from Assisi. He got in to see him, and he says, "That's the man of my dreams." The great family that grew up. The scholar, St. Bonaventure. The great miracle worker, St. Anthony, our friend from Portugal, adopted in Padua. Help us, St. Anthony, find our way home to heaven. St. Dominic raised up to fight the Albigensian heresy, and he was wondering why he wasn't getting anywhere preaching against it, which is basically a recrudescence of Manichaeism, the good God and the bad God, essentially is Calvinism and Jansenism. Today, Calvinism, Protestantism, of course, Calvinism and Jansenism, a Catholic variation, essentially, of Calvinism, which I'll discuss in about several lectures from now. I am living in the shadow of the cross, and I'm going to take as long as I need to take to complete this series of lectures, so that I can do that and at least have it down one final time before I die. It's a little bit different in some instances from what I may have given in the past, but St. Dominic raised up, and he prayed to Our Lady, and she gave him the rosary. Her Psalter, 150 prayers, 150 Hail Marys. Really, 153, we start at the beginning, 153 Hail Marys. That's the number of fish that St. Peter caught after the resurrection. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tua mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tua, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostri. Amen. The Rosary. The Rosary is our weapon against heresy. It's our weapon against sin. It's our weapon against the world, the flesh, and the devil. We use this weapon, and we use it well. Now, it fell into some disuse after the death of St. Dominic. It was revived again by Blessed Alain de Roche, who spread devotion to it, as St. Louis de Montfort taught us. And Our Lady has told us in these latter times at Fatima, she came at Lourdes, fingering the rosary. She would say the Our Father, but she wouldn't say the Hail Mary. Bernadette would say that. And she would say the Glory Be, Our Lady. She fingered the rosary as Bernadette prayed it. St. Bernadette Soubirous prayed it in the grotto of Massa Baal. And she exhorted it to Fatima. She said there are two last remedies being given to man: her most holy rosary in these latter days, and devotion to our Immaculate Heart. And of course, in the miracle of the Sun on October 13th, 1917, Our Lady appeared as Our Lady of Mount Carmel, because it was in the 13th century that Our Lady appeared to St. Simon Stock and gave him the brown scapular. And later in the 14th century, Pope John the 22nd will grant the Sabbatine privileges to those wearing the brown scapular. The scapular is our shield, the brown scapular is our shield, the rosary is our weapon. We should use them. St. Dominic, St. Francis, St. Anthony, St. Bonaventure, and the whole family of St. Dominic, who we profited from so much. We will always be in debt to Bishop Robert McKenna for all the great things he taught us during the time we were in Connecticut, Our Lady of Rosary Chapel. Always praying for His Excellency every day, whom we love, whose example of suffering with joy, with gratitude, inspires us all still. And words cannot express the gratitude we have for the privilege of having known him while we were there. Truly wonderful. Truly a son, a modern-day son of St. Dominic, if ever there was one. Of being learned and holy, and so zealous in promotion of the Holy Rosary. So zealous. Just as Father Martin Stepanich, suffering now. Such a wonderful example of the spirit of St. Francis of Assisi, accepting all but the spirit of Deo gratias. We have great examples of the Franciscan life and the Dominican life in our own times. St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, St. Albert the Great. 13th century gave us St. Gertrude the Great. The secrets of the Sacred Heart being revealed to her. St. Matilda. Oh my. This was an era of great sanctity. But in anger to the devil, and so he had to attack it. He had to attack the glories of Christendom. And even though there were problems during this era of Christendom, even though there were conflicts between church and state as there were in England in 1170 when St. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered as a result of the words spoken inadvertently by King Henry II. Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? He did penance. The Pope ordered him to do penance for saying those words and for opposing St. Thomas Becket, who stood up for the rights of the church despite the problems. At 13th century, 1200s, period of glory. The devil had to attack it. And in the next presentation, I'll explain how in the Renaissance, with the recrudescence of the relativism of ancient Greece, and then through Protestantism, Christendom was attacked. Modernity was born, and hence the modern state, and hence the problems that we have today. We will pick it up then. God bless you. Viva Cristo Rey. Viva la Virgen de Guadalupe. Pray your rosaries. God bless you. Thank you.